Greetings and welcome to our newest podcast episode, Safety Nets Weaved for Ukrainian Refugees. I am Joan Feldbaum-Vidra and I look after sovereign ratings for KBRA. With me is Aaron Joe Banja, who works on project finance, infrastructure, and sovereign ratings at KBRA, as well as Ken Egan, who is KBRA's main analyst on European sovereigns. KBRA has been studying the Ukrainian refugee issue in terms of its political and financial implications and its impact on sovereign credit. And we will be releasing an updated report on the topic quite shortly. So this podcast is a preview of that piece on the current state of financing for the massive flows of Ukrainian refugees and displaced persons. In addition, KBRA recently authored a piece on the refugee issue specifically as it relates to Poland, but it incorporates many themes that we are watching. I encourage you to visit our website for that research and more. And just a note before we start the discussion, the longer the crisis lasts, the more permanent these refugees are, and that tends to amplify risks. So Aaron Joy, can you kick us off and discuss the refugee project that we're working on in Sovereigns and why we are working on it?
Yes, of course, John. Thank you very much. My name is Aaron Joy. I have been helping the Sovereigns team follow the data on what is the biggest migration of people in Europe since World War II, the current Ukrainian refugee crisis. We started to pose questions to ourselves. What is the cost of shelter for these refugees and who pays for it? There are supports in place from official institutions, but who does this benefit? We have been following the large sums of aid that is being made available to help the refugees and displaced people. Just as much as the scale is widely different in terms of sheer numbers, the reception is vastly different this time around for this wave of refugees as compared to recent inflows, and there is more political support and cohesion over the issue. But in our work, we have found funds are being deployed across all corners of the world to assist this massive displacement. For example, the US pledged in its reconciliation bill about a month ago, billions of dollars in support for Ukrainian refugees. The EU, EBRD, EIB, and many other official sources are also pledging support.
Thanks, Joy. We are really looking forward to seeing your work on this in order to understand better how the cost of refugees will be absorbed. Well, how this crisis evolves, for example, if it's more localized to the eastern flank, that could start to stymie the flow of migrants out of Ukraine. But all this is still very uncertain. It's a very fluid situation, of course. But given that, what are some of the building blocks and themes that you are unpacking in your research and analysis?
Yes. So firstly, over 4.5 million Ukrainians have fled since the invasion, and this number is rising by the day. And you're absolutely correct saying that it's a very fluid situation. So far, the political and social reception has been good, and the main concern as the clock runs is the cost of sheltering refugees. Official institutions like the ones I've mentioned are setting up emergency funding that can help the Ukrainian government with spending, for example, on public sector wages, social care, etc. On the other hand, however, understanding the financial support is more tricky because there is a difference between the aid that will be going to European countries which are hosting these refugees. European sovereign governments are estimating how much it will cost their state to provide healthcare, accommodation, education, amongst other vital services to fleeing Ukrainians. And it remains to be seen how this will be funded, as well as how the funds being made available will be allocated.
I get it. And to understand the burden on host country governments and countries, we need a lot more detail on how these funds will be allocated. I understand that. I look forward to clarity on that as well. So now let me turn to Ken, who is KBRA's principal analyst for European sovereigns and European macro views. Ken, what is the macro backdrop to the refugee crisis?
Hi, Joan, and thanks for the question. Well, European economies are all recovering from the COVID pandemic, which I might add is not over just yet. And this recovery is being hampered by the war and inflation, as well as the fact that many countries have a rather pronounced dependency on Russian energy and commodity exports. I want to let you know that we're working on a piece related to these exposures, and so stay tuned for that. But at the same time, the low rate environment, continued refinancing of outstanding asset purchases by the ECB, and relaxation of fiscal rules is supportive for the Eurobloc. For EU countries outside of the Euro, there's more diversion. With, for example, Poland hiking rates several times, but I'll also add that country was more resilient to the pandemic than others.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, now let's turn back again to the work that you guys are doing on the financing being made available for refugees. Can you build on what Joy said about what's been announced in terms of aid thus far?
Sure. So in terms of headline supports, the IMF announced a rapid financing instrument, which is emergency funding of about $1.4 billion. The European Commission already dispersed €300 million to Ukraine using their emergency macro financial assistance tool. The European Investment Bank approved nearly €700 million in immediate financial support. The World Bank put forward the financing of recovery from economic emergency package, or Free Ukraine as it's known, which comprises of grants and loans worth about 700 million in total. So that's underwritten by various sovereigns like the Netherlands and Sweden, and features pledges from the UK and Denmark, amongst others. The UK government's pledged over 200 million in aid. Staying on this, the World Bank and the IMF have enabled donor corridors and funnels so they can facilitate private donations and bilateral donations, like what we've seen with Germany and Moldova. It's not only Europe that's providing support. Several countries have announced support for refugees, including Japan, who's provided $100 million in humanitarian aid. And as Aaron Joy mentioned, the US also announced a massive support package, over $13 billion, covering humanitarian aid and military support. Just as in the case of the war, there's a global response here. But in terms of support from official institutions, the crucial point here is that this funding relates to financing for the Ukrainian government. It doesn't pertain to refugees or the countries hosting them. That being said, however, depending on how the story progresses, we could see official bodies offer support to sheltering countries. The World Bank already announced it would be working on something like this in the coming months.
Ken, that's really fascinating. Thank you so much. Now, turning to those European shelter countries, which have experienced a significant influx of refugees, do we have any idea of the economic costs thus far? And how do we see this developing over the coming months?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to mention here is that the European Commission enacted its Temporary Protection Directive for the first time, which basically fast tracks visa access for refugees to essential areas such as accommodation, welfare, health, education, and ultimately will aid their efforts to obtain employment. I guess we've often seen in the past the barrier for refugees in the labour market is often the integration lag arising from visas. But getting back to the economic cost, because the number of refugees keeps rising for various host countries, it's hard to put a figure on it at the moment. Plus, this directive means people fleeing can take refuge for several years. But for example, the Irish government estimates that it could spend €2.5 billion next year supporting Ukrainian refugees. For other countries, the cost will likely be much higher. Poland in particular, a country which was on a collision course with the EU prior to the invasion of Ukraine. But now, from an EU perspective, it's hard to be critical since Poland are doing the vast majority of heavy lifting with regard to refugees. Over 2.6 million Ukrainians have fled to Poland. The government estimates the cost to the state of sheltering refugees could be €20 billion or more, depending on the final number of people.
Got it. And paying for this?
Exactly. So the question is now, does the Polish government or the Irish government pay for the cost of accommodating the refugees, or will the EU and other official bodies pitch in and help? The European Commission adapted a scheme called CARE, Cohesion Action for Refugees in Europe, to help support sovereigns with sort of financing flexibility. Member states will essentially receive resources redirected from other funds, like the European Social Fund and the Development Fund. Separate to this then, €10 billion from the REACT EU funds are available to member states to support and assist people fleeing Ukraine. The big question is, will it be enough? And the answer is likely no, it won't be enough. We could have potentially a redirection of funds from the EU's recovery fund set up during the pandemic. Remember, we just came through a pandemic and government finances are stretched for many sovereigns. Global debt is rising. And now we have a situation whereby 4.5 million people will have to be integrated into societies across Europe over the next few years. The situation is very fluid. It's changing by the day, as is the economic nature of the crisis. We've seen an example of this last week with the German development bank KfW providing funding to companies impacted by the Ukraine crisis. So you can see how quickly the idea of funding and support is evolving. This theme will likely take centre stage for European politics in the coming weeks and months as the pressure mounts.
Ken, great insights. And would you share with us your view on how the war in Ukraine is uniting Europe?
Sure. So the war is deepening the cohesion that we've seen in Europe through the pandemic. As Aaron Joy noted, the continent is very unified on its receptivity to refugees. refugees have been a point of division for the Union in the past. I guess from a credit perspective, it's a positive that European countries are binding closer together, underpinning the safety of the bloc. And we've seen some examples of this with the announcement of the Strategic Compass, which is a defence initiative, and also Repower EU, which is a move towards a faster transition to sustainable energy. Another big team to watch. We are waiting on the second round vote in the French election, but it's looking like Macron will be re-elected. However, this certainly could be a bellwether election for European unity.
Okay, so the costs are rising for Europe, energy security is a risk, and growth is slowing down. And debt as well is high, but more affordable. But on the other hand, unity is moving in a constructive direction. So lots to watch here. Thank you, Joy and Ken, for all of these insights. And to our listeners, please visit KBRA's website for our coverage on the war and how it impacts different sectors. And always, please feel free to reach out for any further information. Thank you so much.